My name is Sombat. I'm 80 years old, and I want to begin with something that took me most of my life to understand clearly enough to live by. There is a way of moving through this world where almost nothing can truly shake you, not in the deepest place, not in the way that used to cost days, weeks, sometimes entire seasons of inner life. I am not talking about becoming cold. I am not talking about pretending that difficulty does not exist, or that loss does not matter. I have lived too long and known too much real pain to say anything like that honestly. What I am talking about is something far more subtle, a quality of inner ground that does not shift every time the surface of life moves, a place in you that witnesses what happens, without being entirely at the mercy of what happens. And the day you begin to find that place, even imperfectly, even briefly, something fundamental changes in the way you carry your life. Maybe right now this sounds distant from where you are. Maybe life has been shaking you regularly, and you have begun to wonder whether steadiness is even possible for someone like you. A word that landed wrong, a fear that returned before you could breathe, a relationship that moved in a direction you did not choose, a disappointment that settled somewhere in your body and refused to leave quietly. If any of that is familiar, stay with me, because what I am about to share does not ask you to feel less. It asks you to find where you are standing when you feel, and to discover that you have more choice about that location than you have ever been taught. I was born in northern Thailand into a life that had very little patience for vulnerability. My father was a man who believed that showing softness was an invitation for harm. Emotion was acceptable only when it served a practical purpose. I learned, before I had words for it, that the inner world was something to manage, not to understand. And I carried that lesson into everything that followed, into the monastery, into my practice, into the decades of apparent spiritual discipline that looked composed from the outside, while something underneath remained fundamentally unexamined. For many years, I believed I was becoming steadier. I could sit in silence without moving. I could follow the forms of practice with consistency. I could speak about equanimity with what sounded like genuine understanding. But there was a difference between the composed surface I had built and the actual ground beneath it. When something genuinely threatened my sense of self, when someone dismissed me, when a situation reminded me of old helplessness, when an outcome I had invested in failed, the old machinery still activated, not always visibly, but completely, and I would spend hours or days inside the aftermath, telling myself I was reflecting, when in truth I was just repeating the injury in different words. And here's what I didn't understand then. The steadiness I was building was structural, not fundamental. I had built discipline on top of reactivity without ever truly examining the reactivity itself. I was like someone who had learned to hold very still on a boat, but had never learned to swim. The stillness worked until the water got rough enough, and life eventually always gets rough enough. The real shift came from a very simple and very uncomfortable recognition. What shook me was almost never the event itself. It was the meaning my mind assigned to the event in the first seconds after it arrived. Someone was dismissive, and the dismissal itself lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The story my mind built from those 30 seconds, the story about my worth, my place, my future, lasted days. A plan failed, and the failure was simply a fact. The interpretation my mind layered over that fact, the verdict it delivered about what the failure meant about me, was the actual source of the suffering. The event was finite, the story was not. And I had spent decades living inside the stories as if they were the events themselves. If this feels familiar, if you recognize that much of what actually costs you most is not what happens, but what your mind immediately makes it mean, then something important is already opening. Because once you see that the meaning is constructed and not inevitable, you begin to have a different kind of relationship with it. You are no longer simply inside the story. You are also the one who notices that a story is being built. And that noticing, that small distance between experience and identification, is where everything begins to change. Buddhist practice gave me a name for what I was slowly discovering. Awareness, the capacity that exists prior to and beneath every thought, every fear, every story the mind produces. Not a capacity you need to create, one you need to stop covering. And the way you stop covering it is not through suppression or spiritual performance. It is through honest, patient, repeated witnessing of what is actually happening in your inner life when the shaking begins. You know what surprised me most? When I stopped fighting what was shaking me and started getting genuinely curious about it, its power changed almost immediately. Not because the difficulty disappeared, but because curiosity and being possessed are not compatible states. The moment you become genuinely interested in what is shaking you, you are no longer entirely inside it. You have created a small gap. And that gap is not nothing. That gap is the beginning of a different kind of life. The practical application of this in ordinary daily life is what I think of when I hear the phrase, acting like nothing can shake you. The word acting is important because it describes something that begins as a choice before it becomes a natural quality. You are not pretending, you are practicing. You are choosing again and again to return to something steadier in yourself before you respond. You are choosing to feel the initial rise of a reaction without immediately treating it as a command. You are choosing to breathe before you speak from a triggered place. You are choosing not to add the weight of all your history and all your fear to what is, in its original form, usually a much smaller event. That choice, practiced consistently, builds something real over time. Not imperviousness, not emotional distance, but a growing capacity to hold difficulty without being entirely consumed by it. A wider internal space where fear can exist without becoming identity, where anger can arise without becoming action, where disappointment can be felt without immediately becoming a verdict on your entire worth. The shaking does not disappear, but you begin to stand somewhere that the shaking cannot entirely reach. What most people don't realize is that this capacity is built through the unglamorous repetition of very small choices. Every time you notice a reaction without immediately becoming it, you are building something. Every time you pause before speaking from a place of triggered emotion, you are building something. Every time you return to the breath or the body, when the mind begins its familiar storm, you are building something. Every time you meet your own difficulty with curiosity instead of judgment, you are building something. These moments do not feel significant when they happen. Over years, they become the difference between a life that is constantly at the mercy of its surface and a life that has found something beneath the surface to stand on. I want to tell you about one moment that made this very real for me. A situation had arisen in the temple that challenged my sense of my own value and position in a way that reached something very old in me. In earlier years, something like that would have occupied my entire inner life for weeks. I would have built elaborate internal defenses. I would have rehearsed conversations that would never happen. I would have drifted from my practice into a low and persistent mood that I would have called reflection, but that was actually just sustained injury. But this time, something was different enough to notice. I felt the familiar rise, the tightening, the beginning of the old story forming in my mind. And then a question appeared that had never appeared quite so clearly in a moment like that before. Is this the whole truth? Not the situation. The story I was already building around the situation, before it had even finished arriving. Is what my mind is saying actually the complete reality? Or is this the old fear wearing the clothes of the present moment? That question did not dissolve everything, but it broke the automatic merger between what was happening and what my mind was making of it. And in that small break, I made a different choice. I stayed with the sensation rather than following the narrative. I breathed rather than rehearsed. And by morning, something that would have once remained for weeks had passed through in a night. Not because I was stronger, because I was standing somewhere the wave could not quite reach. At 80 years old, I still feel the pull of old reactions. I still notice when something ancient in me wants to respond with the old machinery. The difference is that I rarely follow it all the way now. I know what the stories are protecting. I know how to give difficulty room without giving it command. I know that the ground beneath the surface is real and that it holds. And I know that acting like nothing can shake you is not performance, and it is not coldness. It is the result of years of patient, honest practice, of returning to something true and steady inside yourself whenever the surface moves. That ground exists in you too. It has always been there. You have simply been standing too close to the surface to feel it consistently. And the path toward it does not require perfection or great spiritual attainment. It requires honesty, patience, the willingness to get curious about what shakes you, instead of simply being shaken, and the daily practice of returning, one breath at a time, to the place in you that does not have to move with everything that moves. If these words touch something real in you today, Stay with that for a moment before moving on. And if you feel moved to share, tell me in the comments what it is that shakes you most consistently right now. Not to solve it immediately, just to name it honestly, because sometimes the naming is the first real movement toward the steadiness you have been looking for.